there was a big victory over the last couple of weeks in Washington that no one really seems to recognize or want to recognize it as. But both parties agreed to cut spending. That's why this podcast is called the $2.1 trillion leg up for the American people. That's right. The American people just saw a massive spending cut of $2.1 trillion. How do I know that? Well, my next guest, Pete Sepp of the National Taxpayer Union, he's the president of the union, joined my podcast to talk about just that. And I want to get to it right now. And we started with a discussion on the default. So let's hear what Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayer Union, has to say.
Well, a default on debt can take quite the number of forms, but for a sovereign government to start defaulting on its debt can normally mean that government is unable to make interest payments on its debt or is actually repudiating the principal of the debt or is unable to borrow any more money because it lacks the revenue to support it. So there are a number of ways default could occur, but in the case of the U.S. federal government, as of roughly 2 weeks ago, we were on the precipice of defaulting primarily because we would be unable to cover the spending obligations of the federal government and the debt servicing obligations at the same time, given the revenues that were occurring, and we could not borrow any more money to cover the shortfall.
And did this default have anything to do with the inflation? I mean, I'm just trying to get a picture because I feel like when people read the news, when I read the news, that we got a debt ceiling deal. It looks like we just raised the roof, if you will, but there was some progress. But before we got there, was inflation leading to default as well?
I think inflation had an indirect role in the problems we were facing. Inflation itself doesn't necessarily mean that your debt is going to be in a default situation or your government is, but the fact is we spent way too much money in things like the Inflation Reduction Act, an ironically named piece of legislation. Because the federal government overspent, that contributed to inflation, which in turn triggered responses from the Federal Reserve, like raising interest rates. Well, once the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, then you set yourself up for problems in servicing government debt because it gets more expensive. You have to keep refinancing government debt, and every time you do, you're going to have to finance it at a higher rate. And so that's the indirect portion. Inflation and the responses to inflation kind of did make a contribution to the current situation that we found ourselves in.
Now, before we went on the air, you were telling me that you guys were involved with helping get the debt ceiling deal done. Tell us how you lobbied to get this deal done.
Well, indeed we did, and this was not an easy thing for us to go through because there are many tasks that our government and our leaders are going to have to set themselves to in the very near future to get this country on a better fiscal path. But the deal that could be had right here, right now, to not only avoid a debt default, which would have been catastrophic for financial markets, for retirees, for consumers, the options were far more limited. We knew right away that there was no immediate appetite to tackle the primary drivers of the deficits we experience every year and in turn the national debt. And those drivers are government benefit programs, so-called mandatory entitlement programs. Those were pretty much off the table during these discussions. We also had to maneuver around the topic of defense spending. There were many so-called fiscal conservatives in Congress saying you can't touch defense spending, and in fact we need to increase it given all the threats around the world. Well, we didn't agree with that. There is plenty of waste and poor prioritization in the defense budget, and the Defense Department is one of the worst run in the entire federal government when it comes to having decent accounting practices. We also had the obstacle, of course, on the left. No one in Congress on the Democratic side seemed to have a big appetite for taking a chunk out of federal spending growth, which is the real problem behind deficits and debt. There were some in the so-called Blue Dog Coalition who were willing to at least talk about it, but even they were pretty reluctant until they saw what kind of deal was on the table. So knowing we had a small portion of the federal budget to work with in order to try and restrain the growth of federal spending, knowing we had this deadline that the Treasury said was the so-called X date when we would default, they probably fudged that by a few days, but it was certainly drawing very close. And knowing we had a lot of political gaps to bridge between Democrats and Republicans meant this was going to be a difficult task. It was, I would say, overall, if I were a taxpayer, I'd be thinking to myself right now after passage of this deal, well, this is not the greatest thing since sliced bread, but we at least got our half a loaf, and we could have been left with only a few crumbs if we didn't play this right. And I think we did largely play it right.
You mentioned fudging the numbers. I tell you what, this Biden administration has played around with the IRS. As the taxpayer union, you didn't happen to have a role in making sure cuts to the IRS agents took place. Was that part of your lobbying, or?
We did definitely urge a second look at the $80 billion in additional funding that was given to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden and many of his Democratic colleagues supported in Congress. Yes, that was, in our opinion, a very dangerous move because there were virtually no guardrails on all of that money. Certainly, the IRS needs to revise its customer service procedures, update its computers, have more people on the phone to answer questions from taxpayers. But this $80 billion that was given to the agency was virtually with no strings attached. There were just 3 paragraphs in the entire Inflation Reduction Act that told the IRS how to spend the money. Spend $46 billion on enforcement, spend about $6 billion on customer service, and the rest on business systems and support, with virtually no other specific guidance as to how to spend the money. That has never before happened in the history of the IRS. Every single bill to increase funding for the service has been accompanied with all kinds of specific instructions from Congress. And we reminded lawmakers of that and said, look, you didn't do your duty when the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year. You've got to do it now by giving the IRS funding a haircut and committing from this point forward to do better oversight. We've made a number of recommendations in that area. In fact, I testified before the Senate Finance Committee just 2 weeks ago with 3 other folks on how the IRS funding is going to have to be better allocated going forward.
Would you mind telling us if you were talking directly to Speaker McCarthy? Because I feel like you can get through to Republicans when it comes to on behalf of the taxpayers more than Democrats. Personal aside there, but it's kind of true, isn't it?
Yes. As I mentioned before, there is the Democratic Blue Dog Coalition. There are some moderate Democrats, especially on the House side, who do support some kind of action on deficits and debt that go beyond the standard Democratic line of let's just raise taxes on the rich. But yes, there was a more sympathetic year on the Republican side. However, I would say that we did encounter some opposition to the way this deal was coming together from Republican defense hawks who thought that the budget should actually be increased in that area, and from others who thought that we needed to go for a much bigger, much more expansive deal. I didn't disagree with that notion. I just thought, well, looking back these past 12, 15 years, the success record of trying to go big and get everything done at once has not been a good one. When you take a look at how much potential deficit reduction there is in this deal that was just enacted, $2.1 trillion total, there is not a single piece of legislation that has done that much deficit reduction in the past 10 years. You'd in fact have to go back to the Budget Control Act of 2011 to find a similar number. In fact, right around 2.1 trillion. That was the deal Republicans won when President Obama was in office. A lot of fiscal conservatives, some of whom are still in Congress now, celebrated that deal. They said it was a real big win for Republicans. And we again reminded Republicans during this current negotiation process that, look, you took the win back then with that much deficit reduction. Why not take the win now and commit to do more going forward?
Well, that is so true. And, you know, I honestly was reading about the Times because I want to see what they said, and I want to get your take on it. They said the deal in 2011 with Boehner and Obama led us to more financial hardship even after the deal. Did you see that back then? And do you see this deal being a little more smoother, if you will?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how the Times wants to define financial hardship. They may say, well, the budget reductions and slowdowns in spending increases going forward, well, they were too harsh. I certainly don't think that was the case. Do I think that Congress could have exercised better responsibility in directing where the funding reductions ought to go? Yeah, sure. They didn't. And what was called the sequester started to kick in after the 2011 budget deal, and that meant across-the-board spending reductions in several categories of spending. Not the whole budget, but in several broad categories, there were across-the-board cuts. Or you could also say slowdowns in the rate of increase. Again, that's something Congress should have accepted responsibility for. Do I think that this deal will make that problem a little less difficult? Yeah, because there's a specific provision in this deal that requires regular order appropriations processes to start. And before our eyes all glaze over, the appropriations process is what's responsible for the part of the federal budget that deals with things like transportation, some education, defense, space program, the kinds of things you appropriate money for every year that are generally not automatic benefit programs like Social Security and Medicare. Well, we have not followed the regular order in appropriations for easily 2 decades now. The appropriations process generally gets started in the House or the Senate haphazardly. A few bills pass, most don't, and by the end of the year, Congress has to come to some kind of omnibus, we call it ominous, spending deal. Well, this new debt ceiling deal puts new rules in place that will make it a lot harder for Congress to dodge its responsibility and not confront the appropriations process. And by doing that, you reduce the risk that some kind of automatic cuts are going to kick in that are much more haphazard.
All right. Well, I've got a question about this because you mentioned all the different programs and the government programs. Well, did you guys have any role in the work requirements for SNAP? And look, I kind of agree that people who want to go on these different benefits, if they're able to, should be able to work. I mean, were you guys in the room for those negotiations as well?
Yes. And we had to be aware of the fact that if we wanted this package to get through the Senate, there would have to be some Democratic support. And even in the House, you would have to have at least some kind of Democratic support, because some Republicans would probably drop off. So what we aimed for was broadening work requirements for some adults that are currently receiving food stamps. And so what it's going to say is that you're going to have to be able to show employment for at least 20 hours a week, or meet some other kind of criteria to show that you're looking for work. And right now, the requirement is among able-bodied adults 18 to 49. The age limit's going to increase a little bit, and some of the other definitions of what qualifies as work, that's going to be tightened so that people are going to have to make a little more effort to work, or at least seek work, to get food stamps. It's a compromise, but I think it's a pretty good one. And if you are interested in making incremental progress on this issue, I think you would walk away from that deal saying, okay, there's something to work with here.
I'm now with Pete Sepp. He is the president of the National Taxpayers Union. Just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he testified with regard to the debt ceiling deal. But did you wish you were in the room when Biden and McCarthy were negotiating? I mean, you weren't in the room when they were actually negotiating and finalizing the deal, right?
No, not in that room. Now, we, of course, did have close contact with House leaders on both sides of the aisle, including Speaker McCarthy, but who knows what went on in that room between the president and the speaker. I have wondered what it would be like to be the so-called fly on the wall. Then again, there's that old phrase about you should never want to look at either how legislation or sausage gets made, and maybe this is one of those instances.
What should the taxpayer be surprised most about this deal? Meaning, as we're taxpayers, right? What should we be most surprised about when it comes to these cuts? I mean, cutting spending is music to anybody's ear in America. Isn't that a surprise in of itself that the government actually agreed to cut spending at the end of the day?
Yes, it is. I think that should be the biggest surprise, that taxpayers could walk away with as much as $2.1 trillion with a T dollars in spending reductions over the next 10 years. That's spending reductions or slowdowns in the rate of increase. They're somewhat different things, but the point is we were on one trajectory, and now we have lowered that trajectory by $2.1 trillion. If all of these provisions work as designed, we're talking about an average savings over the life of this bill of $6,200 per person in this country, or $15,800 per average household in this country. That's the amount of money the federal government will save over the next 10 years without raising taxes and cutting or restraining the growth of spending in only part of the federal budget. I think taxpayers should also be surprised that less than a year after the Internal Revenue Service received an $80 billion infusion of cash with virtually no strings attached, we've been able to get a haircut of $20 billion of that funding back. I did not actually expect we would get that far, and I think what it means for the IRS is to say, you've got to sharpen your pencils, you're going to have to focus on delivering good service to taxpayers before you go out and start twisting arms with a lot more collection tactics.
I call this podcast the one leg up with Alex Garrett. I feel like we have a $2.1 trillion leg up for the American people today, and I love that. All right, a couple more questions, if I may. Obviously, National Taxpayer Union wants to do well by the taxpayer by continuing lobbying, but it's sort of like, well, all right, so you got the government to cut spending. What's next?
Yeah, there's a lot that's next, I'm afraid. And this is the part that's going to be difficult. We have yet to confront some of the biggest fiscal problems in the federal government. And by that, I'm talking about entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, other benefit programs that were not touched at all by this debt ceiling deal. And we don't have a whole lot of time to face facts over those programs. The so-called trust fund for Social Security is supposed to be insolvent by the year 2033. That's not our projections. That's the projections of the trustees of the program itself. So we've got 10 years before Social Security will face a benefit cut or a tax increase of at least 25%. Now that is huge. A major implication for a lot of retirees as well as taxpayers. Medicare Part A, the hospital insurance, is in even worse shape. That so-called trust fund is going belly up around 2027. And so we need to confront that even sooner. We are going to have to look at structural reforms, everything from health care vouchers to how we adjust the retirement age, to how we adjust the benefit formulas for all the years that you work. We can't necessarily do that to current retirees, but we've got to put these programs on a more stable path, and we've got to do it soon. I'm often reminded of how many years we've been preaching this message. I can remember back when there was that funny guy with the ears and the Texas twang named Ross Perot in the 1992 presidential campaign saying, we have to do something about entitlements. And Bill Clinton at the time agreed, and so did George H.W. Bush. That's as far as it ever got. It is now 30-odd years later. Back then, there were folks saying these systems were in grave danger, and now they're in even graver danger. We've got to face the facts about those programs.
P, I've loved our conversation so far, but as a National Taxpayer Union, how do you protect the taxpayer? Do you stand up to the IRS on behalf of the taxpayer if they're in trouble? In other words, if there are tax troubles for any average American, can they turn to you for protection, if you will, and for help?
Well, the way we work is to challenge the IRS in court when it is pursuing unreasonable positions. In 2020, we created a public interest litigation arm called the Taxpayer Defense Center. We can't defend every taxpayer in court. We're seeking cases that have a major precedent for all taxpayers, but we also work on the congressional side and even the executive branch side when the IRS makes rules and regulations. We put in comments to help shape the way that instructions to taxpayers are given when they're filling out tax forms, and we're seeking reform legislation as well, things like reconstituting the IRS Oversight Board, which provides a whole new level of managerial guidance to the way the agency works. Citizens who are having problems from the IRS, we can't necessarily help everybody, but we want to hear the problems they're experiencing so that we can then go to Congress, the IRS, even go to court to try and rectify some of these problems.
I love hearing that you are here for the American people. I've got to ask you this, though. If we see issues in this administration with the tax code being monkeyed around with, played around with, can you come back and talk to us about that? If you see any issues with the way they're handling the IRS and even the tax code?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be happy to do so. we could spend a whole other segment, and maybe we will in the future, on a project called Taxpayers for IRS Transformation. Cleverly, Taxpayers First is the acronym. That's a project where we're gathering experts from all over the tax administration field to try and spot these kinds of shenanigans at the IRS and make recommendations to shut them down.
Well, I will be in touch with your people because I'd love to have you back on. And my dad was an accountant, and he actually passed away on the traditional tax day this year. And I thought, for a man who built his life around accounting, what a day to go. I hate to say it like that, but it was a day we'd run to the post office and put in all the returns. That's just a personal story there. So tax accounting and taxes are kind of to my heart, and I felt that right as I'm talking to you here, because obviously we want our taxpayers to be treated well and treated fairly, not only by the IRS but by Congress. And I think you guys are working on making sure that happens. Where can we see your testimony, by the way, before I let you go?
It's right on our website at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. Scroll down to May 16th, and that's when I gave my testimony.
May 16th, NTU.org, NTU.org. Pete Sepp, President of the National Taxpayers Union, thank you so much for joining us today on the One Leg Up podcast.
My pleasure.
And we will have you back soon on this network. And thanks again for listening out there. We'll talk to you soon.